The small ramen shop in Tokyo's Shibuya district had seen better days. Paint peeled from the walls like old skin, and the wooden counter bore the scars of countless chopsticks and spilled bowls. But for Kenji Nakamura, it was perfect. The 60-year-old man sat in his usual corner booth, steam rising from his untouched bowl of tonkotsu ramen as he watched the evening crowd filter in. Kenji wasn't like the other customers. While they hunched over their phones or chatted quietly with friends, he observed everything with the sharp eyes of a predator. His expensive black suit stood out among the casual clothes of office workers and students. The dragon tattoo that crawled up his neck and disappeared beneath his collar marked him as someone not to be crossed. He was Kenji Nakamura, Oyabun of the Crimson Tiger clan, one of Tokyo's most feared Yakuza families. Tonight felt different. Kenji couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. He had learned to trust these instincts during his 40 years in the Yakuza. They had kept him alive through gang wars, police raids, and countless betrayals. His 3 bodyguards sat at nearby tables trying to blend in but failing miserably. Their bulky frames and constantly scanning eyes gave them away to anyone who knew what to look for. The restaurant's owner, an elderly man named Tanaka, moved nervously between tables. He knew who Kenji was, and the Yakuza boss's presence made him sweat despite the cool autumn evening. Tanaka had been paying protection money to the Crimson Tigers for 15 years. It wasn't much, just enough to keep trouble away from his small business. In return, Kenji occasionally used the restaurant for quiet meetings. Tonight was supposed to be one of those nights. At 7:30, the bell above the door chimed, and Kenji looked up from his cold ramen. A young woman entered, shaking raindrops from her long black hair. She wore a simple white blouse and dark jeans. Nothing that would draw attention in the crowded district. But something about her made Kenji pause. She moved with a grace that suggested training, perhaps in dance or martial arts. Her eyes swept the room once before she chose a table near the window. Yuki Sato had been running for 3 months. Not literally running, but moving from city to city, job to job, never staying in one place long enough for her past to catch up. Tokyo was supposed to be her final stop, a place where she could disappear into the crowd of 10 million people. She had found work as a night shift nurse at a small clinic, and this ramen shop had become her regular dinner spot before work. She ordered her usual miso ramen and tea, pulling out a paperback novel to read while she waited. The book was in English, something she had been practicing since leaving Osaka. Learning new languages was one way to become someone else, to leave behind the person she used to be. As she read, she unconsciously pushed up the sleeves of her blouse to keep them out of the way. Kenji's conversation with his lieutenant stopped mid-sentence. Across the restaurant, the young woman's left sleeve had slipped up her forearm, revealing the edge of something that made his blood run cold. It was just a glimpse, a few black lines against pale skin, but he recognized it immediately. After decades in the Yakuza, certain images burned themselves into memory. This was one of them. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade around him. The clatter of chopsticks, the hiss of cooking noodles, the murmur of conversation, all of it became distant white noise. Kenji's eyes fixed on the woman's arm as she unconsciously adjusted her sleeve, hiding the tattoo again. His heart pounded in a way it hadn't since his early days as a street soldier. Boss? His lieutenant Sato followed Kenji's gaze across the room. Something wrong? Kenji held up a hand for silence, still staring at the woman. She was reading peacefully, occasionally sipping her tea, completely unaware that she had just changed everything. The tattoo he had glimpsed was no ordinary design. It was part of a very specific image, one that only a handful of people in all of Japan would recognize. 25 years ago, Kenji had fallen in love with a woman named Akiko. She was the daughter of a rival Yakuza boss, and their relationship had been forbidden from the start. But young love cared nothing for clan politics or family honor. They had met in secret for months, planning to run away together. Akiko had gotten a tattoo to match one of Kenji's, a symbol of their eternal bond. It was a cherry blossom branch with 5 petals, each one representing a promise they had made to each other. But their secret was discovered. Akiko's father found out about the relationship and moved quickly to end it. Kenji never saw her again. He heard rumors that she had been sent away, married off to someone in another city. Some said she had died rather than marry a stranger. For 25 years, he had wondered what became of the only woman he had ever truly loved. Now, in this rundown ramen shop, He had seen that same distinctive tattoo on another woman's arm. The cherry blossom design was too specific, too unique to be a coincidence. His mind raced with possibilities. Could this young woman be Akiko's daughter? The age would be about right. But how had she ended up here in his neighborhood, in his regular restaurant? Yuki finished her ramen and stood to leave, completely unaware of the storm she had unleashed simply by pushing up her sleeve. She left money on the table and headed for the door, her novel tucked under her arm. Kenji watched her go, memorizing every detail of her face and movement. As the door closed behind her, he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal atmosphere, but Kenji remained frozen in his booth. His bodyguards noticed the change in their boss immediately. The old man who had entered the restaurant was gone, replaced by someone haunted by ghosts from the past. Whatever he had seen in that brief moment had shaken him to his core. As rain began to fall harder outside, Kenji finally reached for his phone. He had to know who that woman was, where she came from, and why she carried the mark of his lost love on her skin. The answers to those questions would determine not just her fate, but possibly his own. 3 days passed before Yuki returned to the ramen shop. She had been working double shifts at the clinic, trying to save enough money to move to a better apartment. The small room she rented above a convenience store was barely larger than a closet, and the thin walls meant she heard every argument between the couple next door. But it was cheap and anonymous, 2 things that mattered more than comfort. When she pushed through the restaurant's door that Thursday evening, she immediately noticed something different. The atmosphere felt heavier, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. Several men in dark suits occupied tables throughout the small space, their eyes tracking her movement as she entered. At the center of it all sat an older man in the corner booth, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach clench. Kenji had spent the last 3 days having the woman investigated. His contacts in the police department, city hall, and various businesses had painted a picture of someone trying very hard to remain invisible. Yuki Sato, age 26, originally from Osaka. She had arrived in Tokyo 3 months ago with almost no personal history that could be verified. No family listed, no long-term employment, no social media presence. Either she was running from something or she had never really existed at all. But the most interesting discovery was what his people hadn't found. There were gaps in her past, periods where no records existed at all. The kind of gaps that suggested someone with powerful connections had deliberately erased information. This wasn't the work of an amateur trying to disappear. Someone with serious resources had helped her become a ghost. Yuki chose a different table this time, one with a clear view of the exit. Her training kicked in automatically, cataloging potential threats and escape routes. The men in suits weren't trying to hide their surveillance, which meant either they were amateurs or they wanted her to know she was being watched. Given their professional appearance and disciplined positioning, she doubted they were amateurs. She ordered quickly, keeping her sleeves pulled down tight against her wrists. Something about the older man's stare made her hyper-aware of every inch of exposed skin. When the waitress brought her tea, Yuki wrapped her hands around the cup and took slow, measured breaths. Panic would only make things worse. Kenji rose from his booth with deliberate slowness. Every conversation in the restaurant stopped as he walked across the room, his expensive shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor. Yuki forced herself to remain seated, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She had learned long ago that running from dangerous men only convinced them you were worth chasing. "Mind if I sit?" Kenji asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. His voice was calm, polite even, but underlying steel made it clear this wasn't really a request. Yuki nodded, not trusting her voice. Up close, she could see the tattoos that crept above his collar, intricate dragons and flowers that marked him as someone high in the Yakuza hierarchy. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, but there was something else there too, a sadness that seemed decades old. "You're new to the neighborhood," Kenji said, settling into the chair. "I like to welcome newcomers personally." "That's very kind," Yuki replied carefully. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. "Though I get the feeling this isn't really about welcoming me." Kenji smiled, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. "Smart, I appreciate directness." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. 3 nights ago you were sitting over there. You pushed up your sleeve to keep it out of your food. I saw something that I haven't seen in 25 years. Yuki's blood turned to ice. She had been so careful for so long, always keeping covered, always checking her sleeves and collar. One moment of inattention had exposed everything. She set down her teacup with forced calm, meeting his eyes directly. "I don't know what you think you saw," she said. 5 cherry blossom petals arranged in a specific pattern. Each petal contains a small character that most people would mistake for decoration. But I know what those characters mean because I helped design that tattoo 25 years ago. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped cooking, sensing the tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Yuki's options flashed through her mind in rapid succession. Deny everything, which clearly wouldn't work. Run, which would likely get her caught or killed. Or tell the truth, which might be just as dangerous. "My mother told me never to let anyone see it," she said quietly. "She said it would bring nothing but pain." Kenji's composure cracked for the first time. His hands, which had remained perfectly steady, began to shake. "Your mother, Akiko?" "Akiko Tanaka. She died when I was 15. Yuki watched the older man's face carefully, seeing the name hit him like a physical blow, but she told me stories about a young Yakuza who promised her the world. A man who loved cherry blossoms because they reminded him that beautiful things don't last forever. She kept my name from you. She said it was safer that way, that the past should stay buried." Yuki's voice grew stronger as she spoke, but she also said that if I ever met a man with dragons on his neck who knew about the cherry blossoms, I should tell him that she never stopped loving him, even after they took her away. Kenji closed his eyes, and for a moment the feared Yakuza boss looked like nothing more than an old man carrying 25 years of grief. When he opened them again, tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. "They told me she was dead," he whispered. "Her father said she chose death over dishonor. She chose life. She chose me." Yuki's own eyes filled with tears. But it wasn't easy. They sent her to a small town near the mountains, married her to a man who beat her when he drank. She ran away when she was pregnant, lived on the streets for months. I was born in a shelter for homeless women. The weight of this revelation settled over the restaurant like a heavy blanket. Kenji's men watched their boss with concern, unsure how to react to seeing him so vulnerable. Several customers had quietly paid their bills and left, sensing that they were witnessing something private and potentially dangerous. "Where is she buried?" Kenji asked. "A small cemetery outside Kyoto, no headstone, just a number. She saved every yen she could, but there was never enough for proper funeral rites." Yuki reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph. "This is the only picture I have of her." Kenji took the photo with trembling hands. The woman in the image was older than the girl he remembered, worn down by hardship and struggle. But her eyes were the same, kind and brave and impossibly beautiful. On her left arm, barely visible in the faded photograph, was the edge of a familiar tattoo. "She looks just like you," he said. "People always said that." Yuki wiped her eyes with a napkin. "She used to trace the tattoo with her finger when she told me stories about you. She said each petal represented a promise you made to each other. Love, loyalty, protection, sacrifice, and eternal connection. I failed her," Kenji said, his voice barely audible. "I couldn't protect her. I couldn't keep any of those promises. She never blamed you. She said her father was too powerful, that you would have died if you had tried to stop the marriage. She made me promise that if I ever found you, I would tell you that she understood, that she forgave you." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows. Finally, Kenji looked up at his daughter, because there was no doubt now that this was what she was, and saw not just Akiko's face, but her strength and courage as well. "What happened to the man she married?"
"He died when I was 12.
"Drinking and driving." Yuki's voice held no emotion. "Mother said it was karma catching up with him." Kenji nodded slowly, processing everything he had learned. His daughter was alive and sitting across from him, but she was also clearly in some kind of trouble. People didn't erase their histories and change their names unless they were running from something serious. "Why are you hiding, Yuki?" She looked at him for a long moment, weighing her options. Then she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Because 3 months ago I killed a man." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from a cigarette. Kenji studied his daughter's face, looking for signs of remorse, fear, or madness. Instead, he saw the same calm determination that had carried Akiko through years of suffering. Yuki met his gaze without flinching, waiting for his reaction. "Tell me," he said simply. Yuki glanced around the restaurant. Most of the other customers had left, sensing the dangerous undercurrents in the air. Only Kenji's men remained, forming a protective circle around their conversation. She made a decision to trust this man who claimed to be her father, this stranger who carried her mother's secrets in his eyes. "I was working at a hospital in Osaka," she began. "Emergency surgery department. We got all kinds of cases there. Accidents, overdoses, gang violence. Most of the doctors learned not to ask too many questions about where the injuries came from." Kenji nodded. In his world, there were always doctors willing to treat gunshot wounds without involving the police. Surgeons who could remove fingers cut off as punishment without reporting the incident. Medical professionals who understood that some patients needed to disappear from official records. One night they brought in a young girl, maybe 16, 17 years old. She had been beaten so badly that I almost didn't recognize her as human. Yuki's voice remained steady, but her hands clenched into fists on the table. Multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, evidence of sexual assault. She was barely conscious, kept mumbling about wanting to go home to her mother. The older man's jaw tightened. Violence against children was one line that even the most ruthless Yakuza rarely crossed. It brought too much police attention and turned public opinion against entire families. Smart bosses knew that some boundaries should never be violated. The girl died on the operating table. We couldn't save her. But before she passed, she managed to whisper a name. "Hideaki Matsumoto." Yuki's eyes hardened. I knew that name. He was a businessman who had donated money to the hospital, a pillar of the community according to the newspapers. But the nurses whispered that he liked young girls, that he paid well for silence. You investigated him. I became obsessed with him, started following him, learning his routine, documenting his activities. It took me 2 months to gather enough evidence. Photos of him with other young girls. Recordings of him bragging to his friends about his conquests. I planned to take everything to the police. Kenji almost smiled at his daughter's naivety. But the police were already in his pocket. Exactly. When I tried to file a report, the detective I spoke with already knew Matsumoto personally. Called him a good friend of the department. My evidence mysteriously disappeared from the filing system, and I was told to forget what I had seen if I valued my career. The restaurant's owner, Tanaka, emerged from the kitchen with a fresh pot of tea. His hands shook as he refilled their cups, clearly aware that he was witnessing something that could get him killed if he talked about it later. Kenji gave him a look that promised exactly that fate if he repeated anything he heard. "So you took justice into your own hands," Kenji said. "I tried one more official channel first. A prosecutor who had a reputation for taking on difficult cases. She seemed interested at first, but within a week she called to say the case was being dropped due to insufficient evidence. Later I found out that Matsumoto had photos of her teenage daughter. Insurance, he called it." Yuki's voice grew colder as she continued. "That's when I realized the system would never touch him. He had too much money, too many connections, too much dirt on too many important people. Girls would keep dying while he walked free. What did you do?" I studied his habits for another month. Matsumoto had a routine every Thursday night. He would take young girls to a private apartment he kept across town. Always alone, always after midnight. The building had poor security and no cameras in the parking garage. Kenji found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested in how his daughter had planned her revenge. It reminded him of the careful preparation that went into successful Yakuza operations. Patience, intelligence gathering, attention to detail. I waited for him in the garage. When he arrived that night, he had another girl with him. Couldn't have been more than 15, drugged out of her mind. She could barely walk. Yuki's control finally cracked slightly, anger bleeding into her voice. He saw me and assumed I was another prostitute he had ordered. Started telling me what he wanted me to do to the girl, how much he would pay. That's when you killed him. I had brought a knife, but in the end I didn't need it. When he realized I wasn't there to service him, he tried to grab me. Started saying he would make me watch what he did to the girl, that he would teach me to mind my own business. I was stronger than he expected. We fought, he fell, hit his head on the concrete. The impact killed him instantly. Kenji absorbed this information without judgment. In his world, people died for much less significant reasons. The fact that his daughter had killed to protect an innocent child actually impressed him. It showed she had inherited not just Akiko's beauty, but also her sense of justice. What happened to the girl? I got her to a hospital, made sure she was safe. Used a fake name, paid in cash. She was so drugged she probably doesn't remember any of it clearly. Yuki met his eyes directly. I don't regret what I did. Matsumoto was a monster who deserved to die, but I knew the police would never see it that way. So you ran. I had about 30 minutes before someone would find the body. I went home, packed everything important, and got on the first train out of Osaka. I've been moving ever since, trying to stay ahead of the investigation. Kenji was quiet for several minutes, processing everything his daughter had told him. The story explained her obvious training in situational awareness, her careful attention to escape routes, and her ability to remain calm under pressure. She had been living as a fugitive for months, always looking over her shoulder. They're close to finding you, he said finally. I know. I've seen the same faces too many times in different places. Detective teams working in shifts, trying to blend in but not quite managing it. I figure I have maybe a week before they close the net. What's your plan? Yuki laughed bitterly. I don't have one. I was thinking about trying to get to South Korea, maybe disappear into the underground there. But I don't speak the language well enough and I'm running out of money. That's not a plan, that's a fantasy. You would be caught within days. Do you have a better suggestion? There was challenge in her voice now, the first real emotion she had shown besides calm acceptance. Kenji stood up, pulling out his phone. I'm going to make a call. My men will escort you home to collect your things. Tonight, you'll stay somewhere safe while I handle this situation. You can't just make the police forget about a murder investigation. I can't, but I know people who can. He speed-dialed a number, then paused. There's something you need to understand, Yuki. Once I make this call, once I pull these strings, you become part of my world. There will be debts to pay, obligations to honor. The Yakuza way is not the same as the civilian way. Yuki considered this for a moment. She thought about her mother, who had spent her entire life running from the consequences of loving a Yakuza, but she also thought about the dead girl in the Osaka hospital, and all the other girls who would die if men like Matsumoto were allowed to operate freely. Will I be able to protect people? People who can't protect themselves? In my world, protection is our primary business. Then make the call. Kenji smiled for the first time since entering the restaurant. He saw Akiko's courage in his daughter's decision, but also something new. A strength that came from choosing her own path rather than having it chosen for her. As he dialed the number, rain continued to fall outside the windows of the small ramen shop. But inside, a father and daughter were finally beginning to understand each other, united by shared values and the memory of a woman they had both loved. The conversation that followed would change the balance of power in Tokyo's underworld, but neither of them could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to transform. The safe house was a modest apartment in Shibuya, 3 floors above a pachinko parlor that never seemed to close. Yuki sat on a simple futon, watching the neon lights from the street below paint shifting patterns on the wall. It had been 18 hours since her conversation with Kenji, and she had heard nothing from him since his men brought her here. 2 of his subordinates stood guard outside her door, their presence both protective and confining. They had been polite but firm when she asked about leaving. Until their boss returned, she was to stay put. The apartment was clean but Spartan. A single room with basic furniture, a small kitchen, and a bathroom that had seen better days. It felt like a cell, albeit a comfortable one. Meanwhile, across the city, Kenji sat in a smoke-filled room above a legitimate-looking import business. Across from him sat Detective Inspector Yamamoto, a 20-year veteran of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, who had been taking Yakuza money for almost as long. The man was sweating despite the cool air conditioning, his usually confident demeanor cracking under the weight of what Kenji was asking. This isn't some petty theft or assault charge, Yamamoto said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. We're talking about murder. High-profile victim, political connections, media attention. Half the department is working this case. Matsumoto was garbage, Kenji replied calmly, lighting a cigarette. The world is better without him. That's not how the law works, and you know it. The victim's family has political connections going back 3 generations. They want blood and they have the influence to make sure they get it. Kenji slid a thick envelope across the table. 20 million yen. Enough to retire comfortably, maybe buy that beach house you've been talking about. Yamamoto stared at the money but didn't touch it. You don't understand. This case has attention from the Diet, from the Prime Minister's office. There are task forces involved that I've never even heard of. Someone very powerful wants this solved, and they're bringing resources I can't fight. Then we need to give them someone else. What do you mean? Kenji leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Matsumoto had enemies. Businessmen he had cheated, families he had destroyed, competitors he had eliminated, someone with motive and opportunity who won't be missed. You want me to frame an innocent person? I want you to frame a guilty person for the wrong crime. There's a difference. Kenji's voice grew harder. Find me someone who deserves to die anyway. Someone connected to Matsumoto's business dealings. Make it look like a professional killing over money or territory. The politicians get their closure, the media gets their story, and everyone moves on. Detective Yamamoto looked uncomfortable, but Kenji could see him wavering. 20 million yen was more money than the man would make in 5 years of police work. And the Yakuza boss was right. There were plenty of people in Matsumoto's orbit who wouldn't be mourned. It would take time to set up properly. False evidence, manufactured witness statements, a believable alternative theory of the crime. We're talking about months of careful work. How long does my daughter have before someone identifies her? Daughter? Yamamoto's eyes widened. He had been working with the Crimson Tigers for years, but Kenji had never mentioned having children. The girl who killed Matsumoto, she's mine. There was no point in hiding it now. If Yamamoto was going to help, he needed to understand the stakes. The detective absorbed this information, realizing that he was now involved in something much more personal and dangerous than a simple bribery arrangement. Protecting Kenji's child would make him complicit in ways that could never be undone. The Osaka investigators are good. They've been building a profile, checking security cameras, interviewing witnesses. I'd say you have maybe a week before they narrow the search enough to start making arrests. 1 week. Kenji stood up, the meeting clearly over. That's your deadline. Find me a suitable replacement killer, or find yourself a new line of work. As Yamamoto left with the envelope, Kenji remained in the smoky room, considering his options. One corrupt detective wouldn't be enough. This kind of manipulation required multiple moving parts, several key people who could be bought or threatened into cooperation. The political pressure the detective had mentioned was concerning. It suggested that Matsumoto had been more important than just a wealthy businessman with unfortunate hobbies. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We need to talk about your daughter. Midnight, the old warehouse in Tsukiji. Come alone. Kenji stared at the message, his blood running cold. Someone else knew about Yuki. Someone who felt confident enough to demand a meeting with one of Tokyo's most dangerous men. He forwarded the message to his lieutenant, then deleted it from his phone. Whether this was a trap or an opportunity, he would have to find out. Back at the safe house, Yuki was growing restless. She had memorized every detail of the small apartment, from the water stain on the ceiling to the scratch marks on the wooden floor. The guards outside her door changed shifts every 6 hours, but they never spoke to her beyond basic politeness. She was examining the window locks when she heard footsteps in the hallway that didn't belong to Kenji's men. Too light, too quick, too careful. Her training kicked in immediately, and she moved away from the window, positioning herself behind the door where she would have the element of surprise. The footsteps stopped outside her room. She heard whispered conversation, then the sound of something being slid under the door. After several minutes of silence, she carefully retrieved the item. A single photograph. The image showed her mother, Akiko, but not as the worn-down woman Yuki remembered. This was Akiko at 19 or 20, beautiful and radiant, wearing an expensive kimono and jewelry that suggested wealth. She was standing next to a man in a business suit, both of them smiling at the camera. On the back of the photo, someone had written a single line. Some secrets run deeper than others. Yuki's hands trembled as she studied the photograph. The man next to her mother looked familiar, but she couldn't place where she had seen him before. The setting appeared to be some kind of formal event, a wedding or business celebration. But her mother had never mentioned attending such functions, especially not during the period when she was supposedly hiding from her family. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss, your father is here to see you." Yuki quickly hid the photograph in her jacket pocket and opened the door. Kenji stood in the hallway, flanked by his usual bodyguards. But something was different about his demeanor. He looked older, more tired, as if the weight of the day had aged him several years. "We need to leave," he said without preamble. "Pack whatever you need. We're not coming back here. What happened? Someone else knows about you. Someone who doesn't want you to disappear quietly." Kenji's eyes swept the apartment, looking for signs that it had been compromised. "They left you a message, didn't they?" Yuki hesitated, then pulled out the photograph. Kenji's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He went completely pale, staggering backward as if he had been struck. "Where did you get this?" "Someone slipped it under the door just before you arrived." Yuki watched her father's face carefully. "Do you recognize the man with my mother?" Kenji closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with a pain that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "That's Hideaki Matsumoto," he said quietly. "The man you killed was your mother's husband." The revelation hit Yuki like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin around her as the implications became clear. Her mother hadn't been married to some random abusive drunk. She had been married to the monster Yuki had killed in that parking garage. The man who had beaten her mother, who had destroyed her life, was the same predator who had been murdering children in Osaka. "She never told me," Yuki whispered. "She was protecting you. If you had known who he really was, you might have tried to confront him years ago, before you were strong enough to survive it. But how did someone get this photograph? How did they know to connect me to Matsumoto?" Kenji looked at the image again, noting details he had missed in his initial shock. The setting, the formal wear, the apparent happiness of the couple. This had been taken at their wedding, probably the only photo that existed of Akiko and her husband together. "Only one person would have kept this picture all these years," he said grimly, "Matsumoto's father. And if he surfaced it now, it means he knows exactly who killed his son and why." As they prepared to leave the safe house, both father and daughter realized that their situation had become exponentially more dangerous. They weren't just running from the police anymore. They were being hunted by a family with unlimited resources and a thirst for revenge that spanned generations. The old Tsukiji warehouse smelled of fish and salt, decades of maritime commerce embedded in its concrete walls. Kenji arrived exactly at midnight, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. Overhead lights cast harsh shadows between towering steel shelves that had once held tons of seafood bound for Tokyo's restaurants. He wasn't alone, despite the message's instructions. His most trusted men were positioned outside, ready to respond if the meeting went wrong. But Kenji suspected that whoever had called this gathering would have anticipated such precautions. In the Yakuza world, come alone was more of a philosophical suggestion than a literal requirement. "You're punctual. I appreciate that in a business partner." The voice came from the shadows near the far wall. As Kenji's eyes adjusted, he could make out a figure seated in a wheelchair flanked by two younger men in expensive suits. The speaker was ancient, probably in his 80s, with the kind of papery skin that suggested serious illness. But his eyes were sharp and alert, the eyes of a predator who had never lost his edge. "Matsumoto Sr., I presume." "Former Diet member Matsumoto, if you want to be formal, though I suppose such titles matter little when discussing family business." The old man rolled his wheelchair forward into the light. "You know why I asked you here? Your son is dead. You want revenge. It's a reasonable position." "My son was garbage," Matsumoto said, surprising Kenji with his bluntness. "A waste of oxygen who brought shame to our family name. But he was my garbage, and no one kills a Matsumoto without consequences." Kenji studied the old man's face, looking for signs of deception or weakness. What he saw instead was the cold calculation of someone who had spent a lifetime in politics. Someone who understood that personal feelings were less important than maintaining appearances of strength. "What do you want?" "The girl who killed him. Delivered to me alive and unharmed. In return, the police investigation disappears. All charges are dropped, and your family can continue operating in Tokyo without interference." "And if I refuse?" Matsumoto smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. "Then I use the considerable resources at my disposal to destroy everything you've built. Your businesses, your territory, your reputation. I have friends in every level of government, contacts in the media, and enough money to buy whichever officials I don't already own. You're threatening war with the Crimson Tigers. I'm offering you a business transaction. One life for the preservation of everything else you value." The old man leaned forward in his wheelchair. "The girl is nothing to you. A stranger who happened to kill my son. Why protect her when it will cost you everything?" Kenji was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. From a purely business perspective, it made sense. One person's life weighed against the welfare of hundreds of Yakuza families who depended on the Crimson Tigers for protection and income. Any rational leader would make the trade. "There's something you don't know," Kenji said finally. "Enlighten me." "The girl is my daughter." Matsumoto's composed mask slipped for just an instant, revealing surprise underneath. But he recovered quickly, his political training serving him well. "Interesting. That does complicate matters." The old man was quiet for several seconds, recalculating his approach. "Your daughter." "With whom?" "A woman named Akiko, your son's first wife." This revelation hit harder than the first. Matsumoto's face went completely white, and one of his bodyguards stepped forward in concern. The old man waved him away, but his hands were shaking now. "That's impossible. Akiko died years ago. Hideaki told me she couldn't handle the pressures of marriage, took her own life rather than bring shame to our families. Your son lied to you. Akiko lived for another 15 years after leaving him. Long enough to raise our daughter and tell her stories about the monster she had been forced to marry. You're lying." Kenji reached into his jacket slowly, careful not to alarm the bodyguards. He pulled out a manila envelope and tossed it across the space between them. Akiko's medical records from the years after she left Tokyo. Hospital admissions for broken bones, internal injuries, trauma consistent with repeated domestic violence. Death certificate from Kyoto dated 8 years ago. Cancer, probably caused by stress and neglect. Matsumoto opened the envelope with trembling hands. As he read through the documents, his face aged another decade. The son he had been trying to avenge had been even worse than he had suspected. "My grandson told me Akiko was happy, that they were planning to have children together. Your grandson was a liar and a predator who beat his wife and raped children. The world is better without him, but family honor? Kenji's voice rose for the first time, echoing off the warehouse walls. "What honor is there in protecting a man who destroys innocence? Your family name was already poisoned by his actions. My daughter just prevented him from poisoning it further." The two old men stared at each other across the concrete space, each representing different philosophies about loyalty, family, and justice. Matsumoto had spent his life believing that blood relationships trumped all other considerations. Kenji had learned that sometimes family meant choosing who deserved protection and who deserved punishment. "Even if what you say is true," Matsumoto said finally, "I cannot let his death go unavenged. Too many people know that a Matsumoto was killed. If I do nothing, I look weak. Weakness invites challenges from other families, other political rivals. Then we have a problem. Yes, we do." The tension in the warehouse grew thick enough to cut. Both sets of bodyguards tensed, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. This was the moment when negotiations either reached a resolution or dissolved into violence. "There is another option," Matsumoto said slowly. "I'm listening. A different kind of justice. Your daughter killed my son in what she believed was self-defense and protection of an innocent. By Yakuza law, such killing can be considered honorable under the right circumstances. Meaning, a formal challenge. Single combat between representatives of our families. Winner takes all. Either your daughter faces justice for murder or the matter is considered settled with honor satisfied on both sides." Kenji considered this proposal. Trial by combat was an ancient Yakuza tradition, rarely invoked in modern times but still legally recognized within their world. It would give both families a way to save face while resolving the conflict definitively. Who would represent the Matsumotos? My nephew Takeshi, former military special forces training, undefeated in 17 formal challenges. And I suppose you expect my daughter to face him, unless you have another champion willing to fight in her place? Kenji smiled grimly. "I accept the challenge, but I will be the one representing our family. You're past 60 years old. Takeshi is 28, trained in multiple fighting disciplines enhanced by military conditioning. This would be suicide, perhaps, but it would be honorable suicide, and it would free my daughter from your vendetta regardless of the outcome." Matsumoto studied the Yakuza boss carefully. "You would die for a daughter you've known for less than a week? I failed her mother 25 years ago. I won't fail her." The old politician was quiet for a long time, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well. Tomorrow night, the old sumo training facility in Asakusa. Midnight. Traditional weapons only, fight to surrender or death. witnesses from both families to ensure honor is maintained. As the two groups prepared to leave the warehouse, neither man mentioned the possibility that there might be a third option, one that neither of them had considered but that would become apparent soon enough. Back at the new safe house, Yuki was making preparations of her own. She had overheard enough of her guard's phone conversations to piece together what was happening. Her father was planning to sacrifice himself to save her, just as her mother had sacrificed herself years ago to keep her child safe. But Yuki had learned something important in the 3 months she had spent running. Sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to take control of your own fate. As midnight approached, she made a decision that would surprise everyone involved in the ancient conflict between the Nakamura and Matsumoto families. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just her future, but the future of two powerful families whose destinies had become fatally intertwined. The old sumo training facility in Asakusa had been abandoned for 15 years, but its circular clay ring remained intact. Ancient wooden beams stretched overhead, and paper lanterns hung dark and dusty from the rafters. It was a place where honor had been tested for generations, where strength and skill determined winners and losers according to rules older than the modern world. Kenji arrived first, accompanied by 6 of his most senior men. He wore traditional dark clothing and carried a katana that had been in his family for 2 centuries. Despite his age, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades training his body for violence. But everyone present knew that grace alone wouldn't be enough against a younger, stronger opponent. The Matsumoto party arrived exactly at midnight. The old politician came in his wheelchair, pushed by his nephew Takeshi. The younger man was everything Matsumoto had promised: tall, powerfully built, with the controlled movements of professional military training. He carried modern fighting knives instead of traditional weapons, a choice that was technically within the rules but suggested a practical, rather than ceremonial approach to the combat. "Last chance to reconsider," Matsumoto called across the ring. "This doesn't have to end with your death." "Everyone dies eventually," Kenji replied. "The only choice is whether we die with honor." As the two combatants entered the ring, witnesses from both families took their positions around the perimeter. The rules were simple: fight until one man surrendered or died. No outside interference would be tolerated. The winner's family would consider the matter of Hideaki Matsumoto's death permanently settled. But as Takeshi drew his knives and Kenji unsheathed his sword, a new voice cut through the tension. "Stop!" Everyone turned toward the entrance, where a slender figure in dark clothing stood silhouetted against the streetlights outside. Yuki walked into the facility with the confident stride of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. She carried no weapons, but her posture suggested she didn't need any. "This is a private matter," Matsumoto snapped. "You have no right to interfere." "I have every right," Yuki replied calmly. "You want justice for your son's death. I'm the one who killed him. These men are fighting over something that has nothing to do with them." Kenji stepped out of the ring, his face a mixture of pride and terror. "Daughter, you shouldn't be here. The terms have been set. I will represent our family with honor. Your family, perhaps, but not your daughter." Yuki faced the old politician directly. "I invoke the right of personal combat. I will face your champion myself with the same terms." "Winner takes all?" "Absolutely not," Kenji said. "I forbid it." "With respect, father, you don't have the authority to forbid me anything. I'm not a Yakuza bound by your clan's hierarchy. I'm a free citizen who chooses to fight her own battles." Matsumoto studied the young woman carefully. He could see Akiko in her features, but also something harder, more determined than his late daughter-in-law had ever been. This girl had killed his son in single combat and evaded a nationwide manhunt for 3 months. She was dangerous in ways that her aging father no longer was. "The challenge was issued to your family's representative," he said. Tradition also recognizes the right of the accused to face justice personally," Yuki interrupted. "Unless you're afraid your champion can't defeat a woman." Takeshi bristled at the implied insult. "I'll fight anyone they put in front of me." Then it settled. Yuki began removing her jacket, revealing arms marked with scars from her months on the run. "Same weapons, same rules. But I want one addition to the terms." "What addition?" "When I win, this vendetta ends permanently. No retaliation against my father, his organization, or anyone connected to either of us. The Matsumoto family acknowledges that your son received the justice he deserved and moves on. And if you lose, then you get what you wanted from the beginning. My life in payment for his. The negotiations took another 10 minutes with representatives from both families working out the formal details. But eventually everything was agreed upon. Yuki and Takeshi would fight with traditional weapons in the ancient ring, while their families watched to ensure honor was maintained. As they prepared for combat, Kenji pulled his daughter aside for a private conversation. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "There are other ways to resolve this situation. Name one that doesn't involve innocent people getting hurt." "I'm not innocent. I've killed more men than you could count. But you're also my father, and you've already spent 25 years paying for choices you made when you were young. It's time for me to take responsibility for my own choices." Kenji studied her face, seeing Akiko's determination but also something uniquely hers, a strength that came from choosing her own path rather than having it chosen for her. "Your mother would be proud," he said. "I hope so." The fight itself was shorter than anyone expected. Takeshi entered the ring confident in his superior size and training, expecting to overwhelm a smaller, untrained opponent quickly. But Yuki had learned hard lessons during her time as a fugitive, and desperation had been an excellent teacher. She avoided his initial attacks with fluid movements that suggested formal martial arts training, something no one had mentioned in her background. When Takeshi overextended himself trying to end the fight quickly, she struck with the precision of a surgeon, targeting pressure points and joints with devastating effectiveness. The former soldier went down hard, his military training useless against an opponent who fought like she had nothing left to lose. Within minutes, he was unconscious on the clay floor, blood seeping from wounds that looked worse than they actually were. Silence filled the old facility as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. The feared military specialist had been defeated by a young nurse who fought like she had been training for combat her entire life. "It's finished," Matsumoto said finally. His voice held no anger, only the exhaustion of an old man who had run out of reasons to fight. "Honor is satisfied. The matter is closed." As the Matsumoto party collected their unconscious champion and prepared to leave, the old politician looked back at Yuki one final time. "Your mother was stronger than any of us realized," he said. "If she had stayed and fought instead of running, things might have been very different. She did what she thought was best for her child. Just like you're doing now." Matsumoto nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. Then he was gone, wheeled out into the Tokyo night by his remaining bodyguards. In the weeks that followed, Detective Yamamoto quietly arranged for the Matsumoto murder case to be closed due to lack of evidence. An alternative theory emerged involving business rivals and international crime syndicates, complete with fabricated witnesses and planted evidence that pointed away from anyone living in Japan. Yuki chose not to return to nursing, instead accepting a position within her father's organization. Her unique skills and background made her valuable for operations that required someone who could move in legitimate society without suspicion. She became the bridge between the Yakuza world and the civilian world, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves while honoring the promises her parents had made decades earlier. The small ramen shop in Shibuya remained Kenji's regular dinner spot, though now he shared his corner booth with a daughter who understood both his world and her own place within it. They never spoke about the night in the old sumo facility, but sometimes other customers noticed them touching the cherry blossom tattoos that marked them as family. Years later, when people asked Yuki about her scars and her story, she would tell them that some secrets are worth keeping, but some truths are worth fighting for. The trick is knowing which is which, and being strong enough to live with the consequences of your choices. The restaurant never fell silent again when they entered together. Instead, it filled with the quiet respect that comes when people recognize strength wrapped in gentleness, power guided by principle. Father and daughter had found each other across 25 years of separation, united by the memory of a woman who had loved them both enough to sacrifice everything for their futures. In the end, that love had been worth the wait.